I'm now going to briefly summarize our findings. On economic growth, we project growth in the Canadian economy to be modest this year and next, with real GDP growth averaging only 1.2%. This outlook is shaped by factors such as increased trade uncertainty and the implementation of tariffs, as well as slowing population growth. On inflation, we project inflation to remain near the Bank of Canada's 2% target and assume that the Bank of Canada will maintain its policy rate at 2.5% before returning it to its neutral level of 2.75% late next year. On the fiscal outlook, we project the budgetary deficit will be $68.5 billion, that's billion with a B, this fiscal year, which is 2.2% of GDP. Looking forward, we project the deficit will decline slightly, but remain close to $60 billion through the medium term. On federal debt, we project the federal debt to GDP ratio will be 42.5% of GDP this year, rising over the medium term and remaining well above its pre-pandemic level.
This guy's garage. Like and subscribe.
Number 4, the House of Commons Standing Committee on Government Operations and Estimates, known far and wide, of course, as the mighty OGGO, the only committee that matters. Though I was reading also a headline about a wonderful young man named Louis Jacques, who was running across the country to PEI to raise money for St. Joe's Table. Any relation?
Yeah, that would be my son. Yeah, Mr. Chair. Yeah.
I had to put that on the record.
In Figure 1 of your report, you no longer predict the debt to GDP ratio improving. In fact, it would appear that what was once a fiscal anchor has now been abandoned by this Prime Minister and his government, as your report indicates the debt to GDP increasing to a clearly alarming rate of 42.5%. So my questions are these. Is this sustainable? At what point does it hit a critical point? And should Canadians be concerned?
Can I jump in? Yes. Still working out the kinks. With respect to, thank you for your question. To answer, I think, the most important part of the question first, I think everybody should be concerned. My jokes aside, it's a really serious day, right? This is the first time in 30 years that we've tabled an economic and fiscal outlook where the fiscal anchor of the general and probably most important fiscal anchor for any government is a declining or at least stable debt to GDP ratio. And this is the first time in 30 years that I've seen one in which that ratio is going up over time. So that's definitely a cause for concern. Certainly on our end, we're hoping and certainly expecting the government, as part of Budget 2025, to clearly indicate what the government plans to do to address this and potentially address this problem, because it's certainly not sustainable.
Thank you. So in response to your last statement, again, under the current leadership, this government is set to worsen the outlook of our debt. Have you had any indication that it is going to change course?
Well, the government has indicated that they're planning on tabling a budget on November 4th. I think certainly looking at the public statements of the Prime Minister and Minister of Finance, these numbers probably, I don't think they come as a surprise to them. Some of the language that the Prime Minister has certainly used has been very strong with respect to the economic and fiscal challenges that are facing the country right now. And again, we look forward to seeing the government's plan to manage or address the challenges that Canada faces. As the Parliamentary Budget Office, and as we discussed last week, our job is to set the table for parliamentarians, to present numbers to them. So as parliamentarians, you're well prepared to engage in thoughtful and meaningful discussion regarding how this projection hopefully will not come to pass.
Thank you. In your opening statements, you spoke to the fact that this outlook does not include incremental measures to achieve the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or in other words, our commitments to NATO. And I'm wondering if you would be able to comment on what other spending that may have been included in the Liberal platform is not included in your numbers.
Thank you for your question. The last time that I've looked, there's about 20 billion or so in spending that has not yet been included in our outlook from the Liberal platforms, if it does come to pass. So we will see on November 4th what they will announce and what they don't announce, but roughly that is what's not included in our outlook right now.
Thank you. So last week we talked about the government looking to change the rules for accounting and splitting out capital and operating, and how they may choose to define those things. And I can't find a rationale from the government on why they would overturn a long history of accounting practice with the budget. Can you explain why the Liberals are separating the capital and operating budgets, and why can't they demonstrate progress in the economy without making these changes?
I would note that the government up to this point has indicated that they're planning on maintaining the existing presentation of data, so the traditional measures of debt and deficit that you see in the public accounts that everyone is used to, in addition to presenting this new framework of splitting the operating and capital budgets, or like day-to-day spending plus some sort of investment. It's an approach that happens in other jurisdictions. To the best of my knowledge, pretty much every Canadian province has an operating budget, a standard budget, plus an investment budget. As we discussed last week, the City of Toronto does the same thing. To the extent that it can be additive and helps parliamentarians understand that potentially more money needs to be borrowed over the short term in order to make investments to transition to longer-term sustainable economic growth, potentially at a higher level, that it could potentially be useful. Going back to the point
Sorry, I have to cut you off there. We're past our time, but perhaps we can get back to it next round.
Just what needs to happen? What can government do in order to make the system better?
Thanks for your question. It's a really good question for which, as interim parliamentary budget officer, I am not particularly well placed to answer it. From a government-wide perspective, something that we do mention in the report, and that definitely jumped out to us, was we've been tracking infrastructure spending across government since 2016. But that was the point where the federal government made a big push to increase the size of spending and also increase the size of infrastructure spending writ large, and also spread it out across various departments. And a recurring theme is it's exceptionally challenging and very difficult to actually pull all the data together. And unfortunately, it continues to be the case. So that's the first thing. If one was looking for an opportunity to actually fix, improve the infrastructure spending across the federal government, simply keeping track of it in a better way would be useful, I think, for everyone. And as well, linking to the previous question with respect to the presentation of operating and capital budgets, infrastructure spending and these transfers, that they're payments that go out to other levels of government. It's not traditional capital spending on federal assets. And so conceivably, you'd want to incorporate it as part of your capital budget. But if you're not tracking it, if the government isn't tracking it, it's going to be really hard to actually do that. So that's probably one of the key challenges that the government and the public service is going to face.
Mr. Patzer, 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, everybody, for being here today. I do think it's important to take a look at Table 2 here, and for people back home, as of 2024-25, the public debt charges is $53.6 billion, and that projection is going to increase in 2030 to $82.4 billion. Is that sustainable?
We also see that the debt servicing ratio is increasing over the projection horizon. So every dollar spent on debt is a dollar that is not spent elsewhere. As Mr. Jake said, that the debt to GDP ratio is something that we look at in terms of sustainability. So that is what we're tracking, and that is what we're very focused on.
Yeah, and I mean, that was one of the hallmark fiscal anchors of the Trudeau government, right? And when it was 30.8, it was never going to go higher than that. That was kind of their commitment. And here we are in the table here, it's 41.7, increasing to 43.7. Again, how alarming is that for the average Canadian, for the taxpayer? Because there is only one taxpayer, right?
I'll hazard a response. It should be very alarming, right? These are, I don't know, I think I used the words in French, and which the translators probably got really well, like stupefying, shocking, right? This is not, like, it's not a funny fiscal outlook. It's a really serious fiscal outlook. And we don't lightly use the word unsustainable, right? Unsustainable means you don't have the option of saying, maybe I'll wait a couple of years, I'll see how things go. It means if you don't change, this is done, right? So it's very serious. And I think, as anyone who's managed a household budget knows, if you sit down at the end of the month and you don't have enough money to pay your bills, and it happens month after month after month, you know that something's going to break.
Kind of along that, you look at the federal debt number in that table number 2, 24-25, it's $1,281 billion, and in 2030 it's up to $1,655 billion. What impact does that have on the Canadian economy and for businesses, for taxpayers, for the people who are supposed to be the ones generating the wealth? But when we see the government is in debt, $1,655 billion in the year 2030, what impact does that have?
Well, currently the economy is, that's definitely a big, I guess, one of the big drivers of what's currently happening in the economy, but there's also heightened uncertainty related to trade policies. But if we look at the federal government debt, maybe Christina will be a bit more better place to elaborate. But I would have to say that something to keep in mind is that a great portion of the federal debt is domestically emitted, so it is Canadian banks receiving profit from that debt, and there are various levels or various participants of the financial markets who are involved in that debt market. So it's not necessarily foreign actors who are holding that debt, but it's just important to keep in mind that some domestic actors are also benefiting from that.
Right. So when we look at what happened with tariffs, for example, the Prime Minister said he's going to collect $20 billion in tariffs. And in your report, it says there's only $8 billion. This morning, CBC wrote an article that the Prime Minister quietly removed even more tariffs than what he initially said. So again, we're over $12 billion. There's a $12 billion shortfall here, and we don't really see a path forward in that situation. What impact is that going to have for Canadians?
In terms of the amounts that the government is collecting from the countermeasures, the government has also announced as many measures as we have assumed that it collected. So as you've mentioned in our report, we've noted that it could collect $8 billion in the 3-year span, but it has also announced a lot of support measures.
I am concerned that when you appeared before OGGO last week and you answered a number of questions from all parties, that the next day during question period, the only comments that were made came from a single point of view and did not reflect your comments. I remember hearing you speak about rupture with the United States and, that we're facing a different world from an economic perspective. And so how can we therefore guarantee that your comments today will contribute to improving the quality of parliamentary debate, which is the objective? So that's my first question.
It's a really good question. It's a really good question. I would say on a lot of there's onus on us as an organization, and there's onus on parliamentarians. I'd say the onus on us as an organization is to ensure today's report, it has about 2,500 words in it, in either official language, is to ensure that the words are very carefully chosen. To ensure that, to the greatest extent possible, they can't easily be taken out of context. The other change that we're making in the office, and you see part of it today, being joined by colleagues and the technical experts, is trying to reinforce the technical grounding and the numbers into the presentation to the committee. So trying to take away some of the words and inject some more facts and numbers. The last change that we're making on our side, some parliamentarians may be aware that for the first time ever, we introduced actually a media blackout in the office when the report was released at 9 o'clock this morning. And that was very deliberate because of the invitation from the Government Operations Committee. We wanted to try something very different where we released the report. We had many meetings with parliamentarians to provide briefings and background on the report. And our first on-the-record testimony was here. And the hope was that our words would be going to you first, so parliamentarians would have a very clear sense of what we're saying and how we're presenting the work. In terms of having the next step of having parliamentarians potentially represent the work in a more balanced way, I don't have a good answer for that. But if you figure it out, let me know, and I'm happy to help you implement it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be at the mighty OGGO. Make sure we get that on the record for Hansard. Mr. Jacques and your team, thank you for showing up. Appreciate your work. I would say, with it being well over a year since we've had a budget, it's nice to have some picture as parliamentarians for, as you say, setting the table for what's to come. I hope I want to make sure I understand some of the assumptions that you've made, just so that I understand your very sobering testimony, and I thank you for, mentioning kind of how serious of a moment we're in fiscally. If I look at Appendix A in your detailed economic outlook, you're not forecasting a recession, is that correct? Like you have unemployment, it's up in 2025, but it's back down afterwards in 26 onwards, and you have real GDP growth. It's small, but it's positive 1.2, 1.3 ongoing. So you're not projecting a recession, is that correct?
No,
Okay.
we're not projecting a recession, just very moderate growth.
So our current debt service costs, or even just the amount of debt we're taking on each year, is increasing at an alarming rate without any economic recession or headwinds. Not to say we don't have economic challenges, but my point is your assumptions are that the economy actually is growing from here on out, that unemployment is falling, and we're still seeing some fairly serious increases in annual debt service costs, and substantially, as my colleague has just pointed out, up to about $80 billion a year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Right. So, and I'm not challenging your assumptions, but obviously there are other pathways the economy can take. Some people are saying, well, unemployment actually may continue to increase. Growth might actually be a lot slower than we project. If unemployment goes up further or growth is not as high as you project, what will happen to the deficit and then the subsequent debt service costs?
If the economic path is worse than projected or worse than we anticipate, then the deficit figures will deteriorate.
Right.
I would, and something I think I mentioned to the committee last week, I would say on our end, we're feeling pretty good about where things stand in the short term. So where we are now and going out over the next 12 to 18 months. The big question, and it's a policy question, which isn't in our bailiwick, but certainly is in the bailiwick of parliamentarians, is where do we end up in years 3, 4, and 5? Given the rupture that the Prime Minister has referred to, given the Prime Minister's reference to, quote, there's no going back, how do we get to those areas of growth? What are the policies that are going to be in place to ensure that the Canadian economy can return to its full potential growth?
Right. Yeah. I guess what I'm highlighting, or what I'm glad you're kind of confirming, is we might not be in the worst economic environment yet. And what we're seeing actually with the levels of spending is we're increasing the risk to the fiscal framework of the country before we're in potentially much more serious economic challenges. Like if we're going to spend almost 14 cents of every dollar on interest on the debt without a recession in the next couple of years, what could that be if there is a recession? Could be 15, could be 18, could be, any number. Would you view that as a risk to the framework?
I would view it as, and going back to quote, no one ever got laughed out of the room by quoting the Governor of the Bank of Canada. It's positive growth, but it's not going to feel good for most Canadians across the country. And in a situation, it definitely gives one pause where the economic numbers are positive and the fiscal numbers are negative and substantially negative.
And we're borrowing record amounts of debt in the markets today, correct?
That's our time. I'm
Pardon
sorry.
Pardon me, Chair. Thank you for your indulgence.
Mr. Gasparo, please go ahead.
Thank you. And welcome back to the mighty OGGO. That's for you, Chair. Last time you were here last week, we focused on infrastructure. So it's only appropriate we pivot back to fiscal matters. So looking at our current position, we can't look at it in a vacuum. It has to be viewed, I would say, on a comparative basis. So Canada still maintains its AAA credit rating, and its current debt to GDP ratio is, I think, 2.2%. How does that compare to some of our G7 colleagues?
I can have one.
No.
To Canada relative to other countries is in a more favorable, if you look at the numbers, in a more favorable situation immediately. I would say, like for myself, the analogy is, I don't know, you're 200 pounds overweight and you have 50% body fat, and everybody else in your group, in your weight loss group, has 75% body fat and is like 400 pounds overweight and can't get out of bed. So, like we're in a more advantageous position, and in many ways that's the opportunity where we can hopefully move, we have space and time where we can move quickly to rectify the situation.
So is that a reflection of the current global economic environment?
Yeah, very much so. The member referred to the work of the International Monetary Fund, and a lot of what the International Monetary Fund has been publishing recently on the fiscal side is advice to all countries to reduce deficits, reduce debt, and batten down the hatches and prepare yourself to make some tough decisions. So it certainly isn't advice to Canada. All other countries, and as I mentioned last week, there are some countries looking at France and looking at the UK where their financial markets are certainly rockier than ours right now, certainly in terms of debt issuance. So relatively speaking, we're in a more favorable position. It, at the same time, doesn't obviate the fact that the path that we're on right now isn't sustainable. And we might have more time than those other countries, but we're going to end up in a very similar place without changes.
Right. Thank you.
Great. Before we go to Mr. Gill, just to follow up on Mr. Gasparo's comment, I do get a royalty every time someone calls it the Mighty OGGO, so please continue with that. Go ahead, Mr. Gill.
Mighty OGGO, sir. Thanks for being here, everybody. If trade tensions and tariffs continue, how much worse could things get for Canadian businesses, jobs, and prices? And a two-part question, what would happen to our economy if the CUSMA trade deal was rescinded or negotiated or renegotiated in a way that hurts us?
Yeah, I can take that. So we didn't do a specific scenario, like a downside scenario regarding the renegotiation of CUSMA. But one thing that's important to point out is that our baseline assumption regarding tariffs is that things will improve from current levels with respect to trading conditions with the United States, although we do expect that they will remain less favorable than in the past, but things will improve. So if things don't improve, then I think that would be a direct negative impact on our economic outlook.
Thanks. On what basis are you painting that picture to say it'll possibly improve? It can possibly go down as well.
Our assumption is based on, I think, the stated policy intentions and what we've observed over the past 3 months, and it is a very volatile environment that changes day by day, and some of these assumptions regarding tariffs and sectors are moving targets, but at least from it appears from Canada's perspective, the intention is not to have these countermeasures in place permanently or as a part of fiscal policy. We are seeing from the United States deals are being struck depending on, I guess, various levels of favorability depending on which country, but ultimately as an office we do have to make a baseline projection, and we do a point estimate for our economic and fiscal outlook, and that does require an assumption that we're constantly updating. This one we did think was reasonable, particularly in the context of CUSMA being potentially up for negotiation next year.
Okay. Our debt servicing at currently, I think, I saw the figure, it's $55 billion for the whole year, so it's $1 billion a week roughly. Projected to go up to, I think, $82 billion by 2029-30. At what point would the interest costs start forcing cuts to healthcare, education, and other services? Because the growth rate is not going to be the same as the debt ratio is going, or are we expecting the GST revenues to be matching that growth?
Sorry, excuse me. I'd say in terms of the increase in the debt charge expenses, yet more broadly, and as I mentioned earlier, the path we're currently on isn't sustainable, and the government will need to make choices to either increase revenues or cut spending in order to stop arrest this unsustainable path that we're on. I don't know, we don't put together the budget, we only analyze the budget and put together forecasts, so I don't know precisely what's on the table at this point, beyond what the government's already announced publicly.
So the increase in revenue is possibly through taxes then? Increase in taxes?
Generically. So in a situation where you need to reduce your budget deficit, you need to be able to bring in, on a net basis, more revenue, so you reduce your deficit in order to return to a fiscally sustainable path. You need to either increase your revenue, so more cash coming in, or decrease the amount of money that you're spending, or a combination of both.
How much more time do I have, sir? In your previous appearance before this committee, you said that you weren't aware if the government had any fiscal anchors. In your report, you outlined that the Liberals have abandoned their two previous fiscal anchors, namely that they will no longer have a declined debt-to-GDP ratio, and their budgetary deficits will exceed 1% of GDP. What impact will this have on future government spending if they continue to operate without fiscal anchors?
Last week, the Prime Minister was asked in question period to clarify the fiscal anchors. He did provide some clarification indicating that there's going to be a greater shift to investment, declining level of debt overall. So there does provide some clarity that there are fiscal anchors. I believe the Minister of Finance also provided guidance regarding a target regarding a deficit, a budgetary deficit as a share of GDP anchor. That said, it certainly isn't comprehensive at this point with respect to what they are. It's always helpful to have fiscal anchors, right? It's always useful. It's the reason why hopefully you don't need guardrails while you're driving down the highway.
Got to bet you off there, I'm afraid.
You know, as I reflect on this, I struggle to imagine an alternative in which we were not making the investments that we are making in Canadians right now. Acknowledging, of course, that does, of course, cost, and there is a cost to that reflected in the projected deficit. But I would challenge, and I guess I would question what the alternative is at this moment in time when we know that Canadians need us.
Yeah, I don't know that as interim parliamentary budget officer, I'm well placed to comment on alternative economic or fiscal policy.
And it's that's a fair answer. And I think as members of parliament, as individuals representing our respective communities, being close to the ground, understanding the challenges that our communities face is reflected in the measures and the policies that we've been putting forward.
I just wanted to pick up where we left off when the chair so abruptly cut me off last time. We're issuing a record amount of debt this year, as I understand. The last debt management strategy came out early in the summer. I think about $620 billion has to be issued this year. Is that your understanding as well? Okay. If the government is saying we will spend less and invest more, in theory, these investments will have a return, of course, because investments do have returns. But they continue to borrow short-term debt instruments. How does that, usually you try to match your assets and liabilities, but if you continue to borrow on the short end of the curve, as they say, but making long-term investments, does that not increase the risk to taxpayers that as interest rates change, taxpayers are, and the government's far more exposed to these sensitivity in interest rates such that, our debt service costs could actually increase much more quickly if rates were to go up for any reason? I'll note the rates were dropped recently, but the 5-year yield actually increased after the Bank of Canada increased its rates. Is that your understanding as well? We should be looking at the matching of assets and liabilities?
I think duration matching is a pretty fundamental principle of borrowing and investment to make sure that you're not exposed to fluctuations in the financial market, and you need to come up with cash when in fact you can't because the money's tied up in longer term assets.
Right. Or it's an admission that actually what you're doing is just borrowing to do the operations of government. You don't have to answer that. I'll just leave that there. I read a report earlier this year from the IMF that referenced for every dollar that was spent on interest on the debt, there was a somewhat reduction in spending on social services. Are you aware of that report that came out in the spring, I think? Is that a report that you're familiar with?
Yeah, I'm the report, actually, I think I read the report. I forget it was several months ago, and I read a lot. I forget the precise numbers, but I am familiar with it. But the underlying principle associated with a lot of the basic macroeconomic models is a dollar that the higher your debt and the greater your debt interest costs, it ends up eating up spending in other areas, whether it be social programming or investment or so what have you.
Right. So when you say when you use the word unsustainable, is that also what you're getting at? That the level of debt that we have and the burden of the service costs of that debt is unsustainable, such that a consequence would be a reduction in social service spending?
A reduction in spending. Again, we don't do policy.
Sure.
We do budgeting, and from a basic budgeting perspective, you have spending and you got revenues. And in a situation where you have a large deficit, and effectively it's not, your debt levels are growing at an unsustainable rate, you got to either increase your revenues or you got to decrease your spending.
Right. And so when there were questions asked about increasing debt and deficits 5 and 6 years ago, or saying, after the new administration took over and said they would run some small deficits, debt service costs were about, I think, 7 or 8 cents on the dollar. You're now projecting that goes to 14 cents on the dollar. Some people were laughed out of the room for asking questions about why we should be concerned about this, but here we are. And again, that's before we have any serious economic downturns or even a recession. So would you say that spending is at risk as debt service costs continue to increase? Is that a fair?
That would be conventional macroeconomic policy as practiced by the world.
So are we close to where we were in the mid-90s? Maybe are we closer to where we were in the mid-90s than we were 10 years ago?
The numbers in the mid-90s were far more alarming. This is with an increase, now with the federal debt to GDP ratio forecast to increase. If we don't change things, we're going to end up there again.
Thank you very much.
How can the federal government better collaborate with provinces and municipalities to optimize, I guess, every dollar that is spent?
Going back to, again, 2016, when we started to do work in this area, the need for better collaboration with provincial governments and large municipalities across the country was something that we did note and we did highlight. And in particular, some of the feedback I recall receiving from large municipalities across the country was, it's great that the Government of Canada has cut us a check, and there's already a 10-year capital plan in place, the contractors are lined up, and there isn't a plan to pay people to work between 10 o'clock at night and 6 o'clock in the morning because you have to pay them double time. So thank you for the money, and we'll just add it on to year 11 at this point. I think that working with the existing plans of municipalities and also provinces who are best placed to actually identify what are the most immediate priorities as opposed to exclusively making those decisions in Ottawa. I think that was one of the key findings that we had identified previously. The other one, and again, is really with respect to the construction industry and focused around the trades, because there's a bottleneck, right? So there's a lot of focus on infrastructure. There's a lot of focus on housing, so we do have a housing crisis. And the need to actually, there's only so much capacity to go around to actually build at this point. So whether it's on infrastructure or whether it's on the housing file, trying to take a coordinated approach across all levels of government with limited resources available, I think it certainly makes sense.
In your report, you lowered your economic growth assumptions for this year and next year. Could you speak to what degree does this weaker growth amplify the risk of structural deficits and large deficits that we're seeing right now?
Thank you for your question. So I guess the area where it has the biggest impact is nominal GDP, which is used as an approximation for the tax base of the federal government. And we've revised our outlook for nominal GDP by approximately $13 billion annually between 2025 and 2030, and that's the main impact.
And in the report, we see about $115 billion in new spending. but considering that we have we have weak growth, could you speak to how many of those expenditures could be deferrable to a time where we have a stronger economy?
I think so it's, I'm not going to pass judgment on what could be or should be deferred. I would, however, say that when you look at the composition, so 115 billion over about 5 years, about a third of that ends up being defense spending, so additional defense spending on the part of the government. Another substantial chunk is the decline in revenues associated with the reduction in the lowest personal income tax rate from 15 down to 14, and the elimination of the digital services tax. So, I don't know, could it be deferred? Could those things be deferred at this point? It ends up being very much a policy question of what are the priorities of parliamentarians.
So can you speak to then on whether you see the absence of meaningful expenditure discipline?
It's hard for us. So we published many reports over the past 10 years with respect to the government's efforts around spending restraint and spending review activities. I think, like, up to this point, the results, I would characterize them as best as being uneven. So there's one, in particular, there's one expenditure review activity where the government took credit for underspending for pandemic benefits and declared victory around spending restraint and spending cuts. That said, we're in a new era. The announcements in the official language from the Government of Canada and in the House of Commons is certainly different with respect to the comprehensive expenditure review. And I guess we're going to find out on November 4th.
So you've expressed your doubts on whether the government still has credible fiscal anchors. In your view, what would you count today as a credible fiscal anchor for Canada, and how far is the government from meeting it?
I think the most important fiscal anchor, which the Prime Minister, I think, indirectly touched on in question period last week, is the debt to GDP ratio. So simply the amount of money that's coming into the federal government and our ability to sustain debt levels. And right now, based upon the status quo forecast and the announcements made to date, with plans, we're not on track. The government will not be on track to actually achieve that fiscal anchor. That said, all of us are still waiting for the government to come up with a plan to, well, one, to officially announce their fiscal anchors, as opposed to providing an overview in QP, and also a plan to ensure that they actually are, how they're going to actually respect those fiscal anchors.
And what do you think are the consequences of Canada not having credible anchors in terms of investor confidence, borrowing costs, credit ratings, et cetera?
So the reason why somebody has fiscal anchors is it increases the certainty and the clarity that you're more likely to achieve your objectives, and you're more likely to be able to manage your finances and your budget in an effective way. And the absence of that obviously increases uncertainty. So the lack of transparency in that front results in a situation where, I don't know, you can imagine if you're going into a bank, you want to start a small business, and you're asking them for a couple of $100,000, and they say, well, where's your plan? And you're like, oh, I don't have a plan, but I have a really good idea. Well, do you have any assets?
I have to cut you off there. We're past our time.
This is going to be a bit of a playback from last week, where we talk about the difference between operating spending and capital investment. And a capital investment is an investment in our country. And would you agree that when we are investing in infrastructure, it achieves several objectives? The first is it increases productivity. Second is it increases employment. Third, it dampens inflation. And fourth, it attracts private capital into our country. Would you agree that those four pillars are absolutely critical in a modern economy?
I would agree if it's done effectively. And yeah, I would agree with all those four. I would say for myself, it's the analogy of you drop $100,000 on your house for a renovation. If you expand the footprint of your house and you have additional space, potentially you can resell it and get the $100,000 back. If you drop $100,000 in a luxury kitchen with a boutique pasta maker, potentially not going to get the money back. So, of course, the devil's in the details of what you're actually investing in. But otherwise, yeah, in theory, I don't think you're going to find an economist anywhere in the country or a conventional economist anywhere in the country or around the world who's going to disagree with you.
In Appendix C of your report, you have corporate income tax increasing year over year. In recent months, we have had reports of companies moving south of the border and billions of dollars of investment leaving Canada. Was that taken into account in your projections for the corporate income tax?
Thank you for your question. We did take into account recent information, specifically from the Fiscal Monitor for corporate income taxes, as well as in our projection, we've incorporated the nominal GDP decline, which is our broadest tax base, into our corporate profits projection. You do see a decline in 25-26 compared to the level to 24-25, but what we are still observing is high corporate income taxes coming through the Fiscal Monitor. So perhaps that information that you're referencing is not yet reflected in the Fiscal Monitor. But we have taken into account a decline through the nominal GDP, just to be clear.
Thank you. Are there any concerns that if the government continues on with its current policies, that businesses and investment will continue to leave Canada, leaving the government with less revenue overall?
The simple answer to that question is the status quo approach is not sustainable.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. Additionally, in your report, you mention a risk of prolonged trade uncertainty, bringing about even worse deficits. Does your report also take into consideration the flow of capital leaving Canada during a prolonged trade dispute and how it will affect the ability for our economy to recover?
Good question.
So that's actually one of our downside, I guess, biggest downside risk. And as Jason says, if the current situation, status quo, is not sustainable.
Okay, and I guess my last question for you would be, if the government continues on its current spending levels, when do you project the budget to be balanced?
Is that a trick? Is that a trick question? If you have a very long time. Again, the current status quo is not sustainable. Before. The more immediate pressure for the government, again, looking at the economic forecast, is where we're going to be in years 3 and 4 and 5, and whether the investments that the government plans to make in the economy and capital and infrastructure and the supports they intend to provide to people to retrain and to move across new industries, whether those are effective and whether they're managed effectively. Yeah.
So under the previous Prime Minister, we were told that budgets would balance themselves. Does it concern you that under this current Prime Minister, we don't even talk about balancing budgets?
the bigger concern as the interim parliamentary budget officer and given the mandate of our organization to promote fiscal transparency, the bigger concern for us is the current weakness or unevenness in fiscal transparency, because it leaves, notwithstanding our work, it definitely hinders the work of parliamentarians in doing theirs, because there are some very weighty policy decisions that are going to need to be made in a minority parliament over the coming months very quickly. And the more information that is provided to parliamentarians regarding the current fiscal context, all parliamentarians, the easier, like our organization, the easier it will be for anyone to make decisions. More information shared more widely and a higher quality puts everybody further ahead.
Just a year ago, that your predecessor, Monsieur Giroux, said that the federal government can spend $46 billion more a year and remain sustainable over the long term. And I think he used the year just about 2098. And he said every year until 2098 and remain fiscally sustainable. And so I was just wondering, in terms of maybe concluding comments, and I have one more headline after that, how does this discussion square with that comment from last year?
A lot is. I worked on that report. I was responsible for it, and a lot has changed over 12 months.
Okay, thank you very much for those comments. That's all for me. Thank you.